Title: Racist teacher bullies black girl in class, unaware she's the daughter of the principal. At Westfield High, the classroom was thick with tension as the bell signaled the start of another day. Mrs. Davis stood at the front of her English class, her stern gaze sweeping over the students as they settled into their seats. The air felt heavy with unease, a familiar tension that always seemed to accompany her lessons. As the last students hurried in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Mia Johnson stepped into the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The other students' eyes followed her, some curious, others wary. Mrs. Davis's lips tightened into a thin line as she watched Mia make her way to an empty desk. Well, Mrs. Davis said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, it seems we have a new addition to our class. I do hope you can keep up with our rigorous curriculum. The way she emphasized rigorous made it clear she had her doubts. Mia met her gaze steadily but said nothing. As Mrs. Davis turned back to the board, the atmosphere in the room shifted, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The tension in the classroom was palpable. What happens when a teacher's prejudice collides with a student's quiet strength? Mia's next move could change everything. Mrs. Davis cleared her throat, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Mia. Today we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start? Her gaze swept the room, deliberately avoiding Mia's raised hand. After calling on several other students, Mrs. Davis finally acknowledged Mia with a tight-lipped smile. Yes, Miss Johnson, do you have something to contribute? Mia straightened in her seat, her voice steady. I believe the novel shows how systemic racism. Systemic racism? Mrs. Davis interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. My dear, I think you are confusing this classic American novel with some modern political agenda. A ripple of unease passed through the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others smirked, eagerly anticipating the drama unfolding before them. Mia took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her desk. With all due respect, Mrs. Davis, the racial injustice in the book is a reflection of... That's quite enough, Mrs. Davis cut her off again, waving a dismissive hand. Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written rather than trying to impose your own interpretations. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Mia's jaw clenched, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Davis's face. She remained silent, but her posture spoke volumes, a quiet defiance that seemed to unsettle the teacher even more. Mrs. Davis turned back to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking as she wrote. Now, let's discuss the actual themes the author intended. Can anyone tell me about the symbolism of the mockingbird? As the lesson continued, Mrs. Davis pointedly ignored Mia's attempts to participate. Every time Mia raised her hand, the teacher's gaze would slide past her as if she were invisible. The message was clear, Mia's voice was not welcome in this classroom. Other students began to take notice. A few exchanged worried glances, their discomfort growing with each passing minute. Others, however, seemed to feed off the teacher's behavior, throwing sidelong smirks in Mia's direction. Mia's frustration was evident in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes, yet she remained composed, her pen moving steadily across her notebook as she took meticulous notes. It was a small act of resistance, a refusal to be silenced or pushed out of her education. As the class neared its end, Mrs. Davis announced a group project. I'll be assigning the groups. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place. The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Mia's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the challenge for what it was. She squared her shoulders, meeting Mrs. Davis's gaze with quiet determination. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students began to file out. Mia took her time gathering her things, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Mrs. Davis called out, "Miss Johnson, a word." Mia turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Mrs. Davis." The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. "I hope you understand that in this class we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum." For a moment, Mia said nothing. Then, with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her, she replied, "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Davis. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Mrs. Davis staring after her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing the teacher's face. As the days passed, Mrs. Davis's initial uncertainty hardened into cold resolve. She'd show that girl exactly who was in charge, no matter the cost. The next class would reveal the depths of her prejudice and test MIA's strength like never before. The following week, MIA entered the classroom with her head held high, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Mrs. Davis stood at the front, her eyes narrowing as MIA took her seat. The air crackled with tension, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As the lesson began, Mrs. Davis's focus on MIA intensified. Every movement, every word became subject to scrutiny. "Miss Johnson, is that gum I see you chewing?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. MIA froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. She wasn't chewing gum at all. "No, Mrs. Davis, I..." "Don't lie to me, young lady." "Spit it out this instant." Mrs. Davis's voice dripped with disdain. MIA stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, pantomimed spitting out non-existent gum, and returned to her seat. The silence in the room was deafening. As the class progressed, Mrs. Davis's behavior grew increasingly brazen. She nitpicked every aspect of MIA's participation, from her handwriting to her posture. "Sit up straight, Miss Johnson. This isn't some casual hangout spot," she barked, ignoring the fact that MIA's posture was no different from her peers. MIA's frustration was evident in the tightness of her jaw and the way her fingers curled around her pen. She took deep breaths, struggling to maintain her composure as the onslaught continued. The class dynamics began to shift. Some students, like Lily in the front row, shot sympathetic glances at MIA when Mrs. Davis wasn't looking. Others, emboldened by the teacher's behavior, joined in with snickers and whispered comments. During a group discussion, MIA raised her hand to contribute. Mrs. Davis's lips curved into a cold smile. "Yes, Miss Johnson, do enlighten us with your unique perspective." MIA's voice was steady as she began to speak, but Mrs. Davis interrupted almost immediately. "I'm sorry, but could you please enunciate more clearly? We can't all understand certain dialects." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. MIA's eyes widened, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. The racism, once veiled, now stood naked and ugly before them all. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Mrs. Davis called out, "Miss Johnson, please see me after class. We need to discuss your performance." MIA approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding but her expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Davis looked up, her eyes cold. "I hope you understand, Miss Johnson, that your attitude is becoming a problem. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment." The implication hung heavy in the air. MIA took a deep breath, her voice low but firm. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Davis. I'll continue to do my best as I always have." As MIA turned to leave, Mrs. Davis called out, "Oh, and Miss Johnson, don't forget your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared." MIA nodded, her mind already racing. She knew the presentation would be a turning point. Mrs. Davis would use it as an opportunity to humiliate her in front of the entire class, but MIA was determined not to give her that satisfaction. The air crackled with anticipation as MIA stepped up to deliver her presentation. Little did she know, Mrs. Davis had been waiting for this moment to unleash her most brutal attack yet. What would happen when prejudice and power collided in front of the entire class? MIA took a deep breath, steadying herself as she faced her classmates. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, determined to prove herself despite Mrs. Davis's constant belittling. The project board behind her displayed a meticulously researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As MIA began her presentation, Mrs. Davis's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. She watched like a predator waiting to pounce, her pen tapping impatiently against her grading sheet. The other students shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Halfway through her presentation, MIA paused to answer questions. Mrs. Davis's hand shot up immediately. "Miss Johnson," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel?" MIA's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message, Mrs. Davis." Harper Lee herself. "I'm well aware of what the author said," Mrs. Davis interrupted, her tone sharp, "but I'm more interested in why you seem unable to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. MIA's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Mrs. Davis. I've supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Mrs. Davis stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She strode to the front of the room, positioning herself between MIA and the rest of the class. "Let me make something clear, Miss Johnson. This constant focus on race is not only misguided but also disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps in your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence in the room was deafening. Some students stared at their desks, unable to meet MIA's eyes. Others watched with a mix of horror and morbid fascination as their teacher continued her tirade. Furthermore, Mrs. Davis pressed on, her voice rising, "Your insistence on inserting modern political agendas into classic literature is not only inappropriate but also demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding. I'm beginning to wonder if you're truly capable of handling the curriculum at this level." MIA's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she refused to back down. "Mrs. Davis, I respectfully disagree. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent and—" "Enough!" Mrs. Davis snapped. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the academic standards of this class." As MIA slowly gathered her materials, the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her shoulders, a small voice piped up from the back of the room. "But I thought MIA's presentation was really good." Mrs. Davis whirled around, her eyes flashing. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Smith? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss Johnson in detention to discuss your own academic shortcomings." The student shrank back in his seat, effectively silenced. Mrs. Davis turned back to MIA, who stood frozen by her desk. "Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down so we can move on to presentations actually worth our time." MIA sank into her chair, her face burning with a mixture of anger and shame. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some sympathetic, others cruelly amused. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths. As Mrs. Davis called the next student to present, MIA's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but what could she do? The teacher held all the power, and speaking out would only lead to more humiliation. For now, she would have to endure, but a quiet determination began to build within her. This wasn't over. As MIA sat in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts of justice and retribution, fate was about to deal an unexpected hand. The classroom door opened and Mrs. Davis looked up, a smug smile playing on her lips. "Class, I have an important announcement," Mrs. Davis declared, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've decided it's time for a parent-teacher conference regarding Miss Johnson's performance." MIA's heart raced, a mix of dread and defiance coursing through her veins. She knew her father would stand up for her, but the thought of him confronting Mrs. Davis filled her with anxiety. The other students exchanged glances, some worried, others curious about what would happen next. Mrs. Davis continued, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond her classroom walls. "I've requested a meeting with Miss Johnson's parents after school today. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about her disruptive behavior and subpar academic performance." As the words left Mrs. Davis's mouth, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were steady, purposeful, growing louder with each passing second. The entire class seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a brief pause, pregnant with possibility, before a firm knock broke the silence. Mrs. Davis's eyebrows furrowed slightly, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Come in," she called out, her voice tinged with irritation. The door swung open, revealing a tall, distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. His presence immediately commanded attention, and a ripple of recognition passed through the students. It was Mr. Johnson, the school principal. MIA's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and relief washing over her face. She glanced at Mrs. Davis, who was still blissfully unaware of the connection between the new arrival and her targeted student. Mr. Johnson stepped into the room, his eyes quickly scanning the faces before him. They lingered for a moment on MIA, a flicker of concern passing between them. Then he turned to Mrs. Davis, his expression neutral but his posture radiating authority. "Mrs. Davis," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Mrs. Davis straightened, plastering on her most professional smile. "Not at all, Mr. Johnson. We were just wrapping up a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird. Is there something I can help you with?" Mr. Johnson nodded, his eyes now fixed on the teacher. "Actually, there is. I understand you've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students." Mrs. Davis's smile widened, clearly pleased that her authority was being recognized. "Yes, that's correct. I believe it's crucial to address certain issues before they become more problematic." "I see, and which student might this be?" Mr. Johnson replied, his tone neutral. Mrs. Davis turned, gesturing towards MIA with a dismissive wave. "Miss Johnson, actually no relation to you, of course." She chuckled at her own joke, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Mr. Johnson's eyebrow raised slightly, the only outward sign of his reaction. "Is that so? Well, Mrs. Davis, I believe we should discuss this matter further, perhaps in private." Mrs. Davis nodded eagerly, already imagining the support she would receive from the principal. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. I'd be happy to share my concerns about Miss Johnson's performance and attitude." As Mrs. Davis began gathering her materials, Mr. Johnson turned to address the class. "Students, please continue with your assigned reading. We'll only be a moment." He then looked directly at MIA, a small, reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a subtle gesture but one that spoke volumes. MIA sat up straighter, feeling a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced in weeks. Mrs. Davis, still oblivious to the true nature of the situation, led the way out of the classroom. Mr. Johnson followed, pausing briefly at the door to cast one last glance at his daughter. The look they shared was one of solidarity and shared strength. As the door closed behind them, a buzz of excited whispers filled the room. Students leaned across desks, speculating about what was about to unfold. MIA remained silent, her eyes fixed on the door, knowing that beyond it, justice was finally about to be served. The closed door couldn't muffle the rising voices outside. Mrs. Davis's confident tone gave way to stammering confusion as Mr. Johnson's calm filled the air. How would the teacher's attitude shift when she discovered MIA's true identity? Mrs. Davis led the way to an empty conference room, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She turned to face Mr. Johnson, a smug smile playing on her lips. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this matter, Mr. Johnson. I've been quite concerned about MIA's performance and attitude in my class." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression neutral. "I see. Please tell me more about your concerns." Mrs. Davis launched into her complaints, her voice growing more animated with each passing moment. "Well, for starters, she consistently challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her personal views into every discussion, derailing the lessons I've carefully prepared." As she spoke, Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, allowing Mrs. Davis to continue her tirade. "And her attitude, Mr. Johnson," Mrs. Davis exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "She's constantly disrupting the class with her unique perspectives. Just today, she gave a presentation that completely missed the point of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing solely on racial themes and ignoring the broader literary merits." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow. And you believe this focus on racial themes is inappropriate for discussing a novel that centers around a charged trial? Mrs. Davis faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question. Well, I believe we should focus on the universal themes, not get bogged down in specific issues. I see, Mr. Johnson said, his tone measured. And how exactly has MIA been disruptive? Can you give me specific examples? Mrs. Davis straightened, regaining her confidence. Of course. She constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She argues with other students during discussions, and her body language, the way she sits there, all defiant, it's clear she has no respect for authority. As Mrs. Davis spoke, Mr. Johnson's expression shifted subtly. A hint of steel entered his eyes, though his voice remained calm. Mrs. Davis, I'd like to ask you something. Have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be a student engaged in critical thinking? Mrs. Davis blinked, taken aback by the question. I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way, but, Mr. Johnson, you have to understand, this girl is simply not a good fit for our school. Her previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps a different environment would be more suitable for her. Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I see. And what makes you think MIA's previous education was lacking? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Mrs. Davis said, her voice dripping with condescension. The way she speaks, her focus on certain issues, it's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of rigor we expect here. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. Mrs. Davis, I think it's time I clarified something for you. MIA's previous education was excellent. In fact, I can personally vouch for. Mrs. Davis frowned, confusion evident on her face. I don't understand. How could you possibly know that? Mr. Johnson's eyes locked onto Mrs. Davis, his gaze unwavering. I know because I'm MIA Johnson's father. The color drained from Mrs. Davis's face as the implications of Mr. Johnson's words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant. You're MIA's. Yes, Mrs. Davis, MIA Johnson is my daughter, and I've been listening very carefully to everything you said about her. Mrs. Davis stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. The realization of what she had done, of the prejudices she had revealed to the school's principal and, more importantly, to her father, crashed over her like a tidal wave. Mr. Johnson, I had no idea. Clearly, Mr. Johnson replied, his tone carrying a weight that made Mrs. Davis flinch. But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed. Not only have you demonstrated a clear bias against my daughter, but your comments suggest a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. Mrs. Davis's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation. Mr. Johnson, please, I can explain. I never meant to. Mr. Johnson held up a hand, silencing her. I think you've explained quite enough, Mrs. Davis. We'll be having a much longer conversation about this, but for now, I suggest you return to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we? As Mrs. Davis numbly nodded and turned to leave, Mr. Johnson added, Oh, and Mrs. Davis, I'll be sitting in on your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand. Mr. Johnson's measured tone belied the storm brewing beneath as he stepped back into the classroom, followed by a visibly shaken Mrs. Davis. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Students straightened in their seats, sensing the tension crackling between the two adults. Class, Mr. Johnson addressed the room, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. I believe we need to have an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education. Mrs. Davis stood rigidly by her desk, her earlier confidence evaporated. She glanced nervously at Mr. Johnson, then at MIA, her mind racing to process the revelation she just experienced. Mr. Johnson continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. It has come to my attention that there have been some concerning incidents in this class, incidents that go against everything our school stands for. A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some cast furtive glances at MIA, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Mrs. Davis, Mr. Johnson addressed her directly, would you care to explain to the class why you felt it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students? The teacher's mouth opened and closed, words failing her. Mr. Johnson, I never meant to. Never meant to what, Mrs. Davis? Mr. Johnson's voice rose slightly, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background. Never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature because they didn't align with your narrow worldview. The students watched in stunned silence as their usually mild-mannered principal transformed before their eyes. His words, precise and cutting, laid bare the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface of their classroom for weeks. Let me be clear, Mr. Johnson continued, his eyes locked on Mrs. Davis. Your behavior towards MIA, and I suspect towards other students of color, is not only unprofessional but deeply harmful. You've created an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences. Mrs. Davis attempted to interject, her voice trembling. Mr. Johnson, please, if I could just explain. Explain what, exactly? Mr. Johnson cut her off, his patience wearing thin. Explain how you mock MIA's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes. Explain how you've consistently ignored her raised hand in class discussions. Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking simply because she doesn't conform to your preconceived notions. The color drained from Mrs. Davis's face as Mr. Johnson recounted her actions. She glanced around the room, seeking any sign of support but found only shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. Mr. Johnson turned to address the class once more. Students, I want you to understand something. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences. He paused, letting his words sink in. What you've witnessed in this classroom is not education, it's discrimination, plain and simple, and it stops today. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others nodded in agreement with Mr. Johnson's words. MIA sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and vindication. Mr. Johnson's gaze returned to Mrs. Davis, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. Mrs. Davis, your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the proper channels. For now, I'll be taking over your class for the remainder of the day. As Mrs. Davis gathered her things, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the reality of the situation seemed to finally hit her. She cast one last desperate look around the classroom before hurrying out the door. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before addressing the class once more. I apologize that you've had to witness this, but I believe it's important for you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society. He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture relaxing slightly. Some students looked shell-shocked, others relieved. A few cast apologetic glances towards MIA, the weight of their silent complicity hanging heavy in the air. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat, regaining the class's attention. I know this has been an intense and emotional experience for all of you. We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process what's happened here. For now, class is dismissed early. Please use this time to reflect on what you've witnessed and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive environment. As the students filed out, many paused to offer words of support to MIA. Lily, who had always sat quietly in the front row, approached hesitantly. I'm sorry I never spoke up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared. It won't happen again. MIA nodded, a small smile of understanding on her face. Thank you, Lily. Speaking up is hard, but it's how we make things better. Outside the classroom, word spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups discussing what they'd heard in hushed tones. As MIA emerged, flanked by her father, a hush fell over the hallway, then slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with just a few students, then grew until it echoed through the corridor. MIA walked tall, her head held high. The fear and isolation she'd felt for weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't just seeing her now, they were truly recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Mrs. Davis faced the consequences of her actions. The school board was convened for an emergency meeting, and within hours, a decision was reached. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Mrs. Davis was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car, her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, as MIA approached the school, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now offered friendly smiles and waves. In the hallways, she overheard snippets of conversations about diversity workshops and plans for a cultural awareness club. As she entered her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, MIA was greeted by a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had permeated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, MIA found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school more inclusive. Ideas flowed freely, from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, MIA felt truly heard and valued. After school, as MIA walked out with her father, they passed by Mrs. Davis's now empty parking spot. Mr. Johnson squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. "You know, MIA, what happened here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand firm in the face of injustice." MIA nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face discrimination every day, in and out of school." The events at Westfield High exposed how prejudice can lurk even in educational settings. Mrs. Davis's treatment of MIA revealed deep-seated biases that had gone unchecked for years. But MIA's courage in speaking up sparked a transformation. The school community rallied around, creating a more inclusive environment. New initiatives, diversity training, and open dialogues challenged long-held assumptions. Students and teachers alike were forced to confront their own biases and blind spots. MIA's journey from victim to leader showed the power of resilience in the face of injustice. Her willingness to turn pain into positive change inspired others to examine their own beliefs and actions. It was a stark reminder that while individual acts of bravery can lead to immediate change, the journey towards a truly equitable society is ongoing and requires collective effort.